Welcome back to Beyond the Bible. Today I want to talk about an archaeological discovery that was made that relates to a character from the Bible. It was discovered at a site called Deir Alla, which is located in the Jordan Valley, just east of the Jordan River and near the mouth of the Jabbok River. It's in the modern-day country of Jordan. And this particular site was inhabited from 1700 BC to 400 BC. And what was discovered there is an inscription that was found on a wall of a building that contains a story. The story mentions a man, a seer, named Balaam, son of Beor. And the story tells about how Balaam was visited in a vision by the Canaanite god El, and how he was told that these other gods, called Shaddai gods, were conspiring together against El and against some of the other gods, and they wanted to get this goddess Shagar and have her darken the clouds and the heavens and the skies so that doom and calamity will start to strike the earth. And so Balaam is called to prevent this from happening and use all sorts of different means available to him. Now, we don't have the end of the story. The end is fragmentary and broken apart. But it's interesting because this story connects to the Bible. There's a character in the Bible named Balaam, and we read about him in Numbers chapters 22 through 24. The Israelites have been wandering around the wilderness, and they come to the plains of Moab. And the king of Moab, a man named BALAK, is concerned because he has heard about the military prowess and success of this people. And so he hires a man from a different land and brings him in, and this man's name is Balaam, son of Beor. And he's a seer. And Balak says, I want to pay you to curse these Israelites. In the ancient world, words are very powerful. Cursings and blessings were taken very seriously. And at first, Balaam actually consults God. He's not an Israelite, but in the story, he speaks to Yahweh and tries to listen to Yahweh, and God says, don't go. And so he says, no, I'm not going to go. Then Balak sends another group of people to him and says, really, you should go. And so he says, what do you think, God? And God says, okay, you can go, but only do what I tell you to. So he takes off and is riding his donkey. And in the meantime, an angel of the Lord appears and stands in his way, but he doesn't see this angel. But the donkey does, and so the donkey tries to go off to the side, and Balaam's like, what are you doing? And he beats the donkey, and this happens a second time and a third time. And on the third time, the donkey turns around and actually says to him out loud, why do you keep beating me? Have I ever led you astray before? What are you doing? He says, no, you haven't. And all of a sudden his eyes are open and he sees this angel in the Lord standing in his way. And the angel basically says, you need to follow Yahweh and make sure you obey what God tells you to do. This part's funny, of course, because the person who is renowned and is paid for his seeing ability isn't even able to see the big supernatural thing standing in front of him right there. So there's a bit of comedy. But he shows up to King Balak, and 3 times he delivers oracles. But instead of cursing Israel, he blesses Israel. And King Balak gets really mad and frustrated about this, but Balaam says, hey, I must say whatever God puts in my mouth. Then he delivers a 4th final oracle where he announces the destruction, the impending destruction of Moab and some surrounding Canaanite nations. So clearly there's a few differences between the inscription found in Deir Alla and the biblical text, but they both talk about the same person, a guy who clearly had an international reputation for his dealings with God or various gods. So why don't we take a minute and let's just delve into this character. Who is Balaam? Do we find anything else about him in the Bible? Well, if you read Numbers 22 through 24, which I highly recommend, read the story of Balaam, you'll probably come away with the conclusion that Balaam's not really that bad of a figure. For the most part, he follows Yahweh, listens, obeys, and ends up blessing Israel, which is a good thing. But there are other depictions of Balaam in the Bible too. many of them less than flattering. We see in the book of Micah, this actually is a good depiction. Micah says, hey, Balaam was righteous. Balaam went against King Balak. But from there, it kind of goes downhill. At the end of the book of Joshua, it says that God wouldn't listen to Balaam when he was trying to curse Israel, basically. It says he wasn't blessing, he was cursing. And in Deuteronomy and Nehemiah, it actually says God turned Balaam's curse into a blessing. We don't read anything about that in Balaam's story in Numbers 22 through 24, but that's what these other biblical texts say. In Joshua 13, it actually says Balaam practiced divination. This is a big no-no. That is a major, major sin. And by the time we get to the New Testament, he's mentioned 3 times in 2 Peter, Jude, and Revelation. And by this point, Balaam's name is synonymous with greed, sexual promiscuity, and idolatry. His name is just a bad name that you don't want to be associated with. Well, why did that happen? We read one more thing about Balaam in Numbers chapter 31, that he is killed along with a whole bunch of other foreigners, a whole bunch of other Canaanite peoples. And it says that he was specifically killed for inciting the Baal of Peor incident that we read about in Numbers chapter 25. So I guess you got to go to Numbers chapter 25 to find out what on earth it's talking about here. And we find out in this story, which is different from the Balaam saga, the Balaam cycle, in Numbers 25, the people of Israel are having illicit relations with the Moabite peoples and various other Canaanites. And they have thereby joined themselves in worshiping a different god named Baal of Peor. And one kind of high-ranking Israelite actually takes a Midianite woman into his tent. And this plague starts happening to the people of Israel, and it's not good. And this priest named Phinehas sees what's happening. He's one of the grandsons of Aaron, and he goes to this tent and uses a spear and skewers this Israelite and Midianite while they're in the act. I will let you just enjoy and appreciate this medieval illumination from a manuscript featuring this particular scene. But once this happens, the plague stops, and God actually lauds Phinehas for his zeal, saying, hey, at least Phinehas cares about holiness and about you all acting the way you're supposed to act. And that's the end of the story. But maybe you're asking yourself, well, how does Balaam fit into that at all? He's not mentioned in this story. But when we look at the linguistic clues, we can kind of see the puzzle that starts to form. It's not much of a stretch to say that Baal of Peor, that god, sounds very similar to Balaam, son of Beor, who, by the way, was from a place called Pethor. Further still, one of the locations that Balaam uttered one of those oracles of blessing upon Israel was from a place called Mount Peor. And in both stories, Numbers 22 through 25 22 through 24 and Numbers 25, Moabites and Midianites feature in both stories. They are a connecting feature. And so more than likely what has happened is Balaam's not an Israelite, but he was a seer. And in the Old Testament, seer is practically synonymous with prophet. And so a lot of people probably didn't like the fact that we have a non-Israelite seer, a person who is able to somehow communicate with God. And so a change occurs when assimilated with this story from Numbers 25, where we go from an international seer for hire, like we see in Numbers 22 through 24, and then the Deir Alla inscription, to being synonymous with wickedness and idolatry, and a person who just has a desire for evil and unjust gain. What actually is true about Balaam? Well, it's hard to say. It's hard to say if he was a good guy or a bad guy or somewhere in between. But when we look at the whole Bible, we get a more nuanced perspective about this Balaam character. So what takeaways can we have about Balaam? Well, as it pertains to the Deir Alla inscription, it's that there was clearly a tradition of this well-known figure named Balaam, son of Beor. And some people frequently want to state, all these people and places and things in the Bible are just made up. They're just fictitious stories. Clearly that's not the case. We have extra biblical evidence in the form of an ancient inscription acknowledging that yes, there was this guy named Balaam, son of Beor. He was well known and he was a seer of some sort. He had communication with deities. So the Bible's not just coming up with hogwash. But also, I think Balaam's instructive in that he's a good example of being able to do a deep character study on someone from the Bible. It's really good to take a biblical narrative and learn the story really well and learn the characters in the story, and then do a bit of research and a deep dive. Say, where are all the different places in the Bible where this character is mentioned, and how much can I really learn about them, and what kind of instructive value does this character have on my life? Which brings us to our final takeaway, and this comes from Balaam's story, which is that nothing can thwart God's determination to bless those whom God wants to bless. And sometimes God uses really unlikely people to do that. Author Catherine Dube Sockenfeld has this really good quote to say. She says, Balaam's story stands as a reminder that God does use improbable means to set people on improbable paths. This is especially true of people who are called to enact blessing upon those whom the world once cursed. Maybe, perhaps you are a person who is called to be one of those people that blesses those whom the world once cursed, that blesses God's people, that blesses those who are poor or outcast or marginalized, just like Balaam was called and used by God. But for now, that's our look beyond the Bible. I'll see you next time.